My son-in-law called me a liability. Not to my face. He said it to my daughter in their kitchen. 2 days before Thanksgiving, while I was sitting in their living room pretending to watch football, their voices carried through the drywall, the way voices do in houses built to impress rather than to last. I heard every word. I set down my coffee, looked at the television screen, and didn't move for a long time. His name is Bryce. He sells commercial real estate in Nashville and wears his watch on the outside of his cuff. My daughter met him at a charity gala 6 years ago. She called me that same night, which she rarely did. And I could hear in her voice something I hadn't heard since she was 17, and came home from a school dance walking on air. I was glad for her. I told her I was glad. I meant it. I am 63 years old. My name is Edmund Harlow. Most people who know me call me Ed. A smaller number, the ones I've kept closest over the years, call me by a nickname I picked up in my 30s that I won't bother explaining here because the story behind it takes longer to tell than it's worth. The point is that the people who matter to me know who I am. Everyone else sees what I choose to let them see, which for most of my adult life has been very little. I drive a 2009 Ford F-150 that I bought used and have kept maintained, because a truck that runs is worth more than a truck that impresses. I wear jeans and flannels in the fall, jeans and t-shirts in the summer. My reading glasses are from a rotating rack at the pharmacy. I do not own a single item of clothing with a visible logo. When I walk into a room, I am the kind of man people look past on their way to finding someone more interesting. I have spent 40 years cultivating that. It suits me fine. What I do not volunteer to people is that I have spent those same 40 years building a timber and land management company that now operates across 4 states and employs over 300 people. I started it in 1987 with a used chainsaw, a beat-up trailer, and a contract to clear 2 acres of scrub pine for a utility company outside Knoxville. I did the work myself. When that job was done, I got 2 more. Then I hired a man. Then 2 men. I reinvested almost everything I earned for the first 15 years, lived in a house that cost less than most people's cars, and learned to read a balance sheet the way other men learn to read a map. Out of necessity, because getting lost was not an option I could afford. By the time my daughter was in middle school, the company was worth more than most people in our county would have believed possible. I kept it quiet. I had my reasons. My wife understood. She died 8 years ago, and there is not a day I don't feel the shape of that absence. She was the only person outside of my accountant and my attorney who knew the full picture, and she held that knowledge the way she held everything, with care and without making it about herself. She used to say that real wealth is the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. I believed her then. I still do. My daughter grew up knowing we were comfortable, but not knowing the specifics. When she left for college, I paid her tuition outright without explaining how. When she needed help with the down payment on her first apartment, I wrote the check without ceremony. She thanked me and didn't ask questions, and I told myself that was fine, that I would explain everything when the time was right. The time was never quite right. The years moved faster than I expected, and then Bryce was in the picture, and explaining felt more complicated, and so I kept deferring. That was my mistake. I understand that now. Bryce knew I owned a small business in land management. That was all he'd ever been told, and he had not asked for more. In his world, the measure of a man is legible. It's in the car he drives, the restaurants he prefers, the neighborhood he lives in. I live in a farmhouse on 40 acres outside of Cookville that I've owned since 1994. The house is modest. The land is not, but you can't see what land is worth just by looking at it. To Bryce, I was a widower with a pickup truck and a small regional business who wore reading glasses from a pharmacy rack. He treated me accordingly. He was never rude. He was careful and correct, the way a man is careful and correct with someone he has quietly categorized as beneath his concern. The Thanksgiving dinner was at their house. Bryce had orchestrated it as a kind of debut. His firm's senior partner, a man named Douglas Whitfield, and his wife were coming. A couple named Reese and Catherine Albright, who'd recently moved into their neighborhood. And me. My daughter had called the week before to remind me to dress nicely. I told her I would. She paused, then said, "Dad, I just mean, Bryce's colleagues will be there, and you know how he is about first impressions." I told her I understood. I didn't say anything more than that. What my daughter did not say, and what I heard anyway, was, "Please don't embarrass me in front of these people. Please be presentable. Please understand that the version of you I can bring into this room is a limited version, a manageable version, and I need you to stay inside that frame tonight." I drove up on Wednesday evening and slept in their guest room, which smelled like a candle and had 3 decorative pillows that had to be removed before I could use the bed. Thursday morning, I helped her in the kitchen while Bryce drove to pick up a floral arrangement he'd ordered from a shop in Brentwood. She seemed tense. I didn't add to it. I peeled potatoes and let her talk. And when she mentioned that Douglas Whitfield had just brokered a commercial deal worth $40 million, I nodded and said that was impressive and went back to the potatoes. The guest arrived at 6. Whitfield was a broad man in his late 50s, the kind of man who fills a doorway without trying. His handshake was the performing kind. He had a big laugh that he deployed at regular intervals. His wife wore a blazer and commented on the house in the specific way people compliment things they're sizing up. The Albrights were younger, early 40s, recently relocated from Chicago, in the middle of the particular social hustle that comes with starting over in a new city and needing to be liked. I wore a button-down shirt and clean slacks. I had polished my boots, which were the same boots I wear to walk the property lines in autumn, but cleaned up. They look like what they are, which is good leather that has been cared for. I shook everyone's hand and smiled and made small talk about the drive up and the weather and whether Nashville traffic had gotten as bad as people said it had. It had, everyone agreed. Then Bryce guided me toward the end of the table with the quiet authority of a man seating someone where they won't cause trouble. Dinner was good. My daughter is a fine cook. The conversation at the far end of the table, Bryce's end, was about property values, about a new development going up near Franklin, about the market. I listened more than I spoke. At one point, Whitfield mentioned a land acquisition up near the Cumberland Plateau that had fallen through because the seller turned out to have old timber rights encumbering the deed. He shook his head at the complexity of it. I kept eating. After the main course, Bryce poured wine and began working up to a toast. He thanked everyone for coming, said something generous about Douglas Whitfield that landed somewhere between gratitude and flattery, mentioned the Albrights by name, and then he did not mention me. He poured the wine, he made the toast, he looked around the table with that practiced smile of his, and I was simply not included in the sentence. My daughter glanced at me. I raised my glass with everyone else and drank. It was Whitfield who created the silence. He had been half listening to Bryce's toast, I think, the way powerful men at social dinners often half listen, processing enough to respond correctly while running a second track in their minds. But somewhere in the middle of it, he had turned and looked at me, not the polite social glance of a man being courteous to the father-in-law at the end of the table. A different kind of looking, the kind that means recognition. He set his glass down. "I'm sorry," he said, interrupting himself mid-drink. "I have to ask." He was looking directly at me. "Are you Edmund Harlow? Harlow Timber out of Cookville?" The table went quiet in that particular way. Tables go quiet when something unexpected has entered the room. "I am," I said. He stared at me for another moment. Then he let out a long breath through his nose. Not a laugh, something more controlled than that. And he looked at Bryce. "This is your father-in-law." It wasn't quite a question. Bryce smiled carefully. "That's right. Ed. He runs a small land management. Douglas Whitfield. Whitfield said, ignoring the rest of that sentence, extending his hand again across the table to me as though we needed to start the introduction over. "We've been trying to get a meeting with your company for 2 years. Your regional director keeps telling us you're not taking on new partnership discussions." "That's accurate," I said. "You own Harlow Timber." This time it was Mrs. Whitfield, who had been quiet most of the evening. She was looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "I do. The Cumberland Project," Whitfield said. "The land assemblage. 12,000 acres, consolidated over what? 15 years. My firm tried to broker part of that in 2019. We couldn't get to the right people." "You got to the right people," I said. "They told you we weren't interested." That was accurate too. Bryce had gone a specific color. A fair-complected man goes when the blood has left his face. My daughter was very still. Whitfield made a sound that was close to a laugh, but came from somewhere more complicated than amusement. "Your operation processes, what, roughly 8 million board feet a year through the eastern Tennessee facilities alone." "We don't publish those numbers," I said, "but you're not far off. And you're—" He gestured at me, at the button-down, at the glass of house wine, at the chair at the far end of the table. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "I'm the father-in-law," I said. "Nice to meet you properly." There was a long silence. The Albrights were looking between me and Whitfield the way people watch a tennis ball cross a net, trying to track the speed of it. My daughter put her fork down with a small, precise sound. It was Bryce who spoke first. "Ed never really mentioned the scale of things," he said. The careful smile was back, but it had a different quality now, thinner at the edges. "You never asked," I said. "I said it simply, without heat. That was the truth, and I had no interest in making it more than what it was." Whitfield looked at me for a long moment. He had the self-possession of a man who has sat through many dinners where the room shifted unexpectedly, and he had enough experience to understand that what was happening here was not his story to drive. "Well," he said, picking up his wine-glass again, "it is genuinely good to meet you, Mr. Harlow. I mean that." "Same," I said. The dinner continued. The food got cleared. Dessert was served, my daughter's pecan pie, which is the best thing she makes, and I told her so. The conversation at the table broadened and softened, the way conversation does when tension has been introduced and then carefully left unaddressed. Whitfield talked to me directly for the rest of the evening. We talked about timber markets, about the regulatory pressure on harvest operations in the Southeast, about a bill working through the state legislature that would affect easement valuations. He was smart. I found myself having a real conversation, the kind I don't often get to have at a dinner table. And I appreciated it in spite of everything. Bryce was very gracious for the rest of the evening. That's the word for it. Gracious. Solicitous. He refilled my wine glass without being asked. He brought my coat at the end of the night. He put his hand briefly on my shoulder as the guests were leaving. None of this was lost on me, and none of it was what I wanted from him. After the Whitfields and Albrights left, the three of us stood in the kitchen. My daughter was loading the dishwasher. Bryce leaned against the counter with his arms crossed and said, "You should have told us, Ed." His tone was measured, aimed at reasonable. I thought about that for a moment. "I've been sitting at your table for 6 years," I said. "You seated me at the end of it tonight. I don't think more information would have helped either of us." He started to say something. My daughter touched his arm lightly and he stopped. She walked with me out to the truck. It was cold. The kind of Tennessee November cold that is damp and particular, that smells like wood smoke and wet leaves. We stood in the driveway and neither of us spoke for a little while. "How long?" she finally said. "The company? Since '87. She nodded slowly. She looked at the ground, then up at the sky. "Why didn't you tell me?" This is the question I've turned over many times since that evening, the one I didn't fully answer for her that night, and that I have been trying to answer honestly for myself ever since. The easy version is I grew up watching what money did to people in my family. My father spent his life performing a version of prosperity he couldn't sustain. My uncle built something real and then watched his children fight over it before he was in the ground. I decided early that I would keep the work separate from the life, that I would be known for who I was in a room rather than for what I was worth on paper. That's the easy version. The harder version is that I was afraid, not of being used, or, not only of that, I was afraid of becoming invisible in a different way. The way my father became invisible the year his business failed, when people stopped returning his calls and he stopped going to church, and he sat in his chair every evening like a man deciding how much of himself was left. I did not want my worth as a person to be contingent on a number. So I kept the number quiet and told myself it was wisdom. What it cost me, what I gave up without fully understanding what I was giving, was the ability to let the people closest to me carry the whole truth of who I am. My wife had it. My daughter didn't. That asymmetry was mine to own. I owned it, standing in that cold driveway without quite saying all of it out loud. "I should have told you sooner," I said. That's true. I had reasons that made sense to me, and some of them were good reasons, and some of them were just fear dressed up as principle. She didn't say anything. "I'm not angry at Bryce," I said, and I meant it, though I want to be precise about what I meant. I was not angry. I was something more like clear-eyed. I understood exactly what he had seen when he looked at me, and I understood that I had, in some ways, arranged for him to see it. A man cannot spend 40 years making himself look like something he's not, and then feel wronged when people believe him. She said, "He didn't ask, but you didn't offer." "No," I said, "I didn't." She hugged me before I got in the truck. A long hug, tighter than usual, the kind that is also an apology and a question and something she didn't have words for yet. I held on to it. I drove back to Cookville that night instead of staying, which I planned to do. The roads were clear and the sky was dark, and I had the windows cracked a little, the way I like them in the cold. The air coming in sharp and moving. I thought about Whitfield's face at the moment of recognition. I thought about Bryce's color draining. I thought about my daughter very still in her chair. I thought about what the judge had said to me years ago when I first set up the company trust and the estate documents. He was not a man who wasted words. He looked over the paperwork and then looked at me and said, "You've been careful. People who are this careful are usually afraid of something." I asked him what he thought I was afraid of. He thought about it seriously, the way he thought about everything. "Being seen," he said, "and being missed." I didn't argue with him. He was right, as he usually was about the things that mattered. What I know now, at 63, sitting in a farmhouse on 40 acres with no mortgage and no audience, and all the time I need to think clearly, is this: the hiding was never really about protecting myself from the wrong kind of attention. It was about protecting myself from the right kind. The kind where someone knows everything and stays anyway, or leaves anyway. And either way you have to live with the truth of it. I gave my wife that. I should have given my daughter that years ago. I have not spoken to Bryce about it since that night, not directly. My daughter and I have talked more in the 4 months since Thanksgiving than we had in the previous 2 years, which tells me something. She asks questions now. Good questions. I answer them. Last month she drove up to Cookville by herself, without Bryce, and I took her out to walk the back property, all 40 acres, through the timber and along the creek and up to the ridge, where on a clear day you can see for miles. She grew up on this land and hadn't walked it in years. She stopped at the ridge and looked out and was quiet for a long time. "This is yours," she said finally. Not a question, just absorbing the fact of it. "Ours," I said, "eventually." She looked at me. "You really should have told me." "I know. I'm not saying I would have treated you differently. I know that too." She turned back to the view. The trees were bare and the air was cold, and the light was the thin, honest light of February in Tennessee. "I think you were lonely," she said. "I think you kept this secret, and it kept you company, and it also kept you alone." She was right. She is her mother's daughter in the ways that matter most. That sentence found the thing I had been walking around for 40 years without naming it. I don't regret building what I built. I don't regret the caution. The long years of keeping my head down, and the work speaking for itself. I don't regret the farmhouse or the truck or the reading glasses from the pharmacy rack. Those things are still true. They're still me. What I regret is the assumption that the only way to be known honestly was to be known as less than I was. You can be a man in a flannel shirt on a used truck and still be fully known by the people you love. Those two things were never in conflict. I made them a conflict because I was afraid. That was the cost, and I was the one who paid it. In 40 years of careful silence, and in a chair at the end of a table I could have bought. If you are the man who keeps the number quiet and calls it wisdom, I'm not saying you're wrong. I kept it quiet for 40 years and I'm still here. But look around the table at the people who love you and ask yourself honestly how much of yourself you have let them hold, because the hiding has a weight, and the weight goes somewhere, and one day someone will ask the right question in a room full of people, and the secret will answer for itself, and you will be left standing in a cold driveway explaining yourself to your daughter at midnight, and wishing you had started that conversation a long time before it became necessary.